Kenneth here, and it's been a while since I've made another video, but I come across a few things on, uh, social media, Facebook, YouTube, and all that about different topics that I know I've covered a little bit, and I'm actually going to be doing a response to a couple videos put out by someone who's decently known. And now, when I say I'm doing a response video to this isn't attacking. This isn't trying to discount anything that he's ever done, anything that's ever been done with his ministry. This isn't critiquing opinions on other issues, but this is particularly directed towards the issue that's brought up in the video, namely his presentation on history of the Bible as we have it today in English, particularly in King James onlyism. Now, Mr. Pearl of No Greater Joy Ministries is, I would say, seems to line up more closer to the Peter Ruckman, Gail Ripplinger side of things. At least it seems that way. I do know that he propagates some claims about certain translations, such as the NIV, as well as a particular view of textual history that I don't think can be substantiated. And so these are things that we are going to have to face in the Christian community or in the church from unbelievers. We have these attacks and these issues of the text being undermined from unbelievers, and we will be quick to correct them. We will be quick to gear up and defend the faith. And of course, the purpose of defending the faith and the purpose of apologetics, and especially in this area, is to what? Is to open a door for the gospel to get into somebody's heart. It's to open the door for us preaching the gospel to the lost, that they might be saved in turning and believing in Jesus Christ. And so we will approach and correct and refute what they will say. However, sometimes when there are people within the church who propagate a view of textual history that just, I don't think it's just not documented. You can't document it. And with the advent of the internet and the fact that nowadays, just me on my own phone, I can pull up so many different translations from history. I can look at manuscript, I can read digitized manuscripts written, in, say, the 4th century, Codex Sinaiticus. You can look at it online. You can go to different portions of the text, and you can actually see the Greek that it was written in. But anyways, with that being available to us, that only makes us more responsible for what we teach and what we preach, and many of the things that we assert. So what this response video is going to take a look at some of these things and hopefully equip you with the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, so you're not sitting here always looking through videos. But it's also to help you do your own study and to question things, and not necessarily for the sake of questioning, but for the sake of proving and testing. That way you may seek that which is true, because if God is truth and Christianity is the truth, we proclaim that, then that's what we want. We want the truth. And so we shouldn't be afraid of that. And so let's go ahead and get started, and I'll just I'll interject as we go along.
Okay, we're here down in my paint studio, and I'm going to illustrate what I've got to say with a little painting. We're going to talk about the greatest hoax of all times perpetrated upon the church. And 99.9% of Christians have fallen for it and been deceived. The deception has been so successful that most Christians don't even know there's an issue. And when the issue is raised, people are so comfortable that they mock it as if it were some flat earth theory. So we're going to go into that today and make it very clear where you can understand it. Okay, we're talking about Bible text. We're talking about Bible issues. Now, we're not going to speak in terms of critical text, conflations, recensions, such things as that. We're going to make it so plain that even a seminary graduate will be able to understand it. When I was in Bible college, I took Greek. I was excited about taking Greek because the preachers I all heard corrected the Bible and told us what the Greek really said. So I thought I didn't have a Bible that I could trust. I had to go and learn Greek. That's the only way I really know what the Bible had to say. So when I got into Bible college, I was really excited. I thought, wow, this is great. Finally, I'm going to be able to understand the Bible in the original languages. And then when I got in Greek class, I was shocked. They gave me a copy, or at least I bought a copy, of the 25th edition of the Westcott and Hort's Greek New Testament, called Nestle Allen Greek New Testament. And so about the 6th week into the class, I was confounded. I realized that I wasn't learning original Greek. I was simply taking the definitions I was given out of lexicons and translating them. And so it was years later when I got out of Bible college and actually began to study. One of my professors came by where I was selling some paintings at an art show. And I said to him, now it wasn't my Greek professor, but he was one of the college professors. I said to him, how is it you never told me that the Greek Bible we were using was only less than 100 years old and was not the original Greek? I said, how come you didn't tell me that it came from the Sinaiticus Vaticanus text and represented a small majority, less than 1% of all the manuscripts that are available, and that the King James Bible came from the Textual Receptus, the traditional text, the text the church had always used, and that the new Greek text that Nestle Allen had was invented out of a manufactured text of the 1840s, 42. He said, huh? And I repeated it. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I was again shocked that here was my college professor, one of them who corrected the Bible based on the Greek, and he had no idea that the Greek text he was using was not the original Greek text. It was a manufactured fraud less than 100 years old. And so when you use books like Strong's Concordance and refer to the Greek words, many of those definitions are inaccurate. Many of the words are inaccurate because they come from the corrupted text. We're going to look at that.
Okay, so first couple issues that we're going to deal with here. So number one, some of these statements are going to, and he's going to go a little bit more into a couple of those details, but I think it's going to end up kind of being misleading, and here's why. He basically is going to generalize things in such a way, oversimplify things in such a way that you're going to come out with an odd conclusion in regards to what is actually true and what the facts actually are. One of the things that he did say is that this is the greatest hoax upon Christianity. And when you say something like that, you've got to be, you bear a lot of responsibility in that. And now that's going to be God's dealing with him. But when you make such an assertion, especially when you look at the background of what we have been offered today as far as English translations go, and don't get me wrong, I'm not going to defend all English translations. There are translations that and I've gone through this before in some of my other videos, as far as you shouldn't just even worry about even picking up some of these other translations. But I think we have a decent number of useful translations. And if you want to use the King James, use it. I'm not against it. I still read it in my own studies and readings, along with a couple others. But one of the things that he talked about was the Bible and Greek. Now, when he went to Bible college, in his day, now the internet was not as big a deal as it is today, and information was not as accessible to the common person. Oftentimes, if you wanted some of these works, you had to hope that your local city library could even get a hold of it. Or maybe you had to travel to, if you wanted to see manuscripts, you had to travel to universities or the Trinity Library in Dublin, Ireland, just to see, is just one place that has some manuscripts to look at. Well, today that's not that big a deal anymore. I can get on my phone and, like I mentioned before, and I can look up all these things. And here's the thing: that's going to be the thing that undermines much of what he's going to say. The one thing he said was for Bible college, he bought a 25th edition of Westcott and Hort. Now, I have right here, this is an old one I picked up from a church library. It wasn't being used at all, so they had no qualms with me taking it home with me. This is a Westcott and Hort text. This particular one was published in 1895 by the American Bible Society. It's mildly revised, but it's essentially the same thing that came out in 1881. Now, Westcott and Hort, which I assume he'll get more into later, they are heavily maligned by the crowd of King James onlyists, particularly on the more fringe side. Now, there are things that I would have debated them on, and there are some things that I can criticize them for, such as their lack of criticism for Darwinian evolution, which many Christians in that day, many well-intended, upstanding Christians, were kind of unsure about what to do with that because the science hadn't caught up to the claims of Darwin. But that does not mean that they were intent on derailing the church with the Bible. They were simply desirous for the Bible to be accurate because there are issues of manuscripts. One of the things he said, and I think he'll get into, is that the King James comes from the TR that the church has always used. That's not true. As a matter of fact, I do have let me get it here, a TR. Now, this is what he would refer to as the TR. The problem is, he said this was, at the time, less than 100 years old. This came after that, after the Westcott and Hort text. This particular text was produced, I think it was produced in 1892 or 3, but it was picked up after Scrivener. This is the one who collated this. After Scrivener passed away, I believe the Trinitarian Bible Society picked it up and published it. Now, what this particular Greek text, it is a Textus Receptus as it exists today. However, there was no interlinear, if you will, between the King James or Bible translations at the time. So, and the King James used 7 or so printed Greek texts from the Reformation era that began with Erasmus and moved on to Stephanus and then Beza. Excuse me. And they had differences, and they had to make decisions on which readings they were going to take between those two texts. And they also even referenced the Latin Vulgate and all that. But what Scribner said was, why don't we make a Greek text that reflects the choices of these translators? And so that's what this is. So it's a Greek text to reflect the English translational choices that came from a collation of 7 or so printed Greek texts. And so you can't call this an original. And by the way, he mentioned something in regards to that it wasn't the original Greek. Well, I'm kind of uncertain as to what he means by that, because this here, I wonder if you can see it in the camera. That's not original Greek. That is minuscule. This is a developed minuscule Greek. It's got capital letters, lowercase letters, no spaces, no punctuation, just as the Westcott and Hort. I don't know if you can see it, but that's the same thing. It's got the breath marks and whatnot. The original Greek, as in what Paul wrote, as in how Paul wrote, how John, Peter, so on and so forth, how they wrote in Greek, was a majuscule Greek. It was first century Koine Greek, which was all capital letters, no spaces, no punctuations, no diacritical marks, none of that. That is actually reflected in the oldest manuscripts that we have, in the uncials and in the papyri. You can actually read you can look at the Greek and you'll see that it's all capital letters, no space, no punctuation. That is original Greek. This is a reflection of the original Greek. Actually, that's the way original Greek was, minus the space. But anyway, so you can already see that there's some issues with what he asserts. This is technically over 100 years old now. However, this came after the Westcott and Hort text. And one last thing in passing, he said 25th edition, and he called it Nestle-Aland. Now, this is a Nestle-Aland 28th edition. The difference between Westcott and Hort and the Nestle-Aland texts, and some say, well, how come they have to have 28 different editions? Can they get it right the first time? The reason why there are so many editions is because you see down here, they're all the footnotes in regards to variants within the manuscript tradition, because every single Greek manuscript of the text of the New Testament varies in some way, shape, or form from another. And what this is doing is this is giving you the information on particularly what is meaningful and viable. The vast majority of variants are not meaningful because you can't translate them outside the language, so it doesn't change the meaning. Roughly 4,000 of them or so are viable or are meaningful, but a handful of those are even viable. And so what this is doing is just giving you information on the textual variants. Now, if you pick up that TR, I think I've already showed it on screen, but if you open it up, there are no notes. There are no notes at the bottom of the page, even between the TR texts, which would be good to have. But what they're doing is they're just giving that there. Now, the more manuscripts that we find and compile and collate and document, and they look at, these manuscripts found in Syria or something, of 1 Peter or of John, at John 1:18 it reads God, monogenes theos, or no, it reads monogenes huios, or whatever. They document from those manuscripts, and they're still doing that. That's the only reason they keep coming out with new ones, is they're just updating that information. They're not giving you different Bibles. So again, it took that was maybe a 5-minute reel of his, and it took over 10 minutes just to kind of work through some of those issues. So that's why it's important to number one, get the information right, but because it takes a long time to go back over it and actually explain what the information actually is.
Over 5,000 portions of the Bible in Greek, many of them preserved by the Greek church in the Byzantine Empire, actually in Greece, where the language has been continually spoken from the day of Christ onward. Those 5,000 plus manuscripts are what the King James Bible comes from. It's called the received text, or the Textus Receptus. And until the middle 1800s, when German rationalism came to the forefront, when Darwinism rose up, when the Seventh-day Adventist Church was being formed, when atheism was coming to its height and spiritualism was growing, and people were rejecting Christianity, rejecting the church, rejecting the supernatural for natural explanations for everything. During that period of time, German rationalism wanted to dispose of Scripture. So they developed the idea that the Bible had been passed down from translator to translator and was inaccurate. And there was one man named Tischendorf, a young man, 28 years old, who decided that it was his job to prove that the Bible was inaccurate. So Tischendorf began to search for manuscripts, any kind of a Greek text that might differ with the standard Greek text that the church had used for 2,000 years. So he went to North Africa and went through a library in a monastery on Mount Sinai, a place that had preserved old text very well because of its extremely dry environment. And there he found a manuscript that appeared to be old, and it came to be called the Sinaiticus, Mount Sinai text. He came back with a portion of it and went back and got the rest of it at a later date. And he declared that this was the true and accurate Bible. Now, it differed with the standard text in literally thousands of places, even in the Gospels alone. And so Tischendorf, with German scholarship, passed this off as the real Bible. And then Westcott and Hort picked up on it, and they never got to see that text, but they picked up on it, took a handwritten copy, and produced a Greek Bible that came out in the 1880s. And that Greek Bible has Greek words in it that don't appear in any ancient Greek text that they created to fill in. Now, the text that Tischendorf had was not written in the ancient Koine Greek. It was written in the more modern Greek. But Westcott and Hort back translated it into the ancient Koine Greek to make it look more legitimate. And then they published their Greek Bible and created a new English version based on it. In 1901, the American Standard Version came out, and since then 400 English Bibles have been translated, all based on that corrupt manuscript. Now here's their argument. The argument is that this was a 4th century manuscript. And being a 4th century manuscript, it was older than any other whole Bible found. And that's true. It was nearly whole, and it was older than any whole Bible. But here is the argument. Since it's older than, say, 6th century Greek manuscripts, 5th century Greek manuscripts, late 4th century Greek manuscripts, since it's older, therefore it's more accurate. Now here's the argument. Let me paint it for you here.
Okay, so I had to cut that one off a little bit earlier than I wanted to, just because there are, again, some broad statements and assertions that unfortunately are, I don't know a better way to say it other than misleading. I'm not trying to impugn character or anything, but again, you are responsible for the words that you put out and the teachings you put out. And some of the issues with this are, number one, it's very broad and simple, but there are a couple mistakes. For example, he says we have about 5,000 plus manuscripts, which we do. I don't know the exact count, but it's somewhere in the realm of 57 or so hundred. And that ranges from small fragments such as the P52. That's the Papyri of John. That's the oldest that we know of that is still extant, and it's probably about the size of this card. And then of course there are whole Bibles pretty much that are pretty much all intact. Now, the part that's wrong is, number one, that is not technically where the King James comes from. Now, we could actually say that, all Bible translations are heirs of those manuscripts, But you might be able to say, well, the King James and the New King James and the modern English version, as well as Young's literal translation and so on, are actually closer to the broad swaths of those manuscripts. But again, we're talking about these oversimplified statements. As a matter of fact, the most read Byzantine, not TR. Textus Receptus is kind of a loose term, and it refers to the texts that were collated during the era of the Reformation by Desiderius Erasmus, Robert Estienne, and Theodore Beza. Now, there was another text out there known as the Complutensian Polyglot. But again, those are actually collated in the West, and as a matter of fact, only go back to roughly 24 or so manuscripts. Like the entire uh, foundation of the TR texts happens to be roughly in the realm of 24 or so manuscripts. Might be a little more, but uh, that's not there. And also, there's influence from the Latin Vulgate and from the Western. As a matter of fact, it's more the TR represents generic language. And again, this isn't even the real TR as what was available to Erasmus, Estienne, and Beza. This again came centuries later, but the TR is indicative of the common language that the Byzantine text reads in terms of variants. But even there are, as a matter of fact, I have a majority text right here. This is a Hodges and Farstad majority Greek text. Now, this is a good representation of the Byzantine text. If you want the Byzantine text, there's also, I think, a Robinson and Pierpont. But this is a faithful representation of the Byzantine text, and it would actually require almost 2,000 updates to the TR in the King James and therefore the New King James. So if you're going to make a majority text argument for any one variant, would you be willing to update, say, Luke 2:22? Luke 2:22, the TR reading is not the majority reading. I believe it's in Colossians 1 where it says, in whom you have redemption through his blood. The majority text is not contained through his blood in Colossians. It contains it in Ephesians, but would you be willing to update that in the King James? And I'm pretty sure he wouldn't. So that part, again, that is a wild statement that when you don't place it in context, yeah, I can say that, yeah, the King James, New King James, and MEV are representative of the majority text to an extent, to be fair with that. As a matter of fact, the New King James is probably the closest because it actually gives you, and I'll show you here, this is a New King James. In the, I'm just going to pick a random one out. In the New Testament, actually, how about this? I'll pick out, let's pick out Revelation 16:5. I'm just to show you. So Revelation 16:5, the one who is and who was and who is to be, or the coming one, basically. And it says down here in the footnote that says the Nestle-Aland text reads, who was the Holy One. That's Nestle-Aland and majority text. Are we going to update the King James there? And so, again, the conflation of King James TR majority is wildly inaccurate. The next thing to say is, he talks about this didn't come up until German rationalism and all this other stuff. Here's the problem with that. In every era where Christianity spread to, there was always somebody trying to attack the validity of the text of the Bible. I mean, that was in the days. I mean, how about the days of the apostles? Let's talk about the Gospel of John and First John. It's widely believed amongst scholarship that John wrote that in response to Cerinthian Gnosticism, Cerinthus, who was leading people away from the church. It happened during the era of persecution with what was his name? I had his name I had his name in my head. Uh, it was I can't remember his name. But anyways, there were pagan scholars at the time that were attacking Christianity. That folks such as I believe Tertullian was one wrote a uh, uh, who wrote a defense of the Christian faith against one of these folks. How about post uh, how about post persecution after the peace of the church? You had Arius, who found many followers in the area of Syria and Antioch, and Athanasius stood up to Arianism, again, questioning the deity of Christ and certain texts of the Bible. And then, I mean, we can keep going through each portion of history and see people attacking the Bible. So just making a broad general statement like that just kind of doesn't work. I mean, yeah, there was much in terms of scholarship and philosophy over, especially in Germany, that did try to question the validity of the Bible, but it wasn't anything new. Now, Constantine von Tischendorf. Now, if you go read his firsthand account of how he acquired this manuscript, you will find that in any fair reading about him, I'm not going to say that I would defend everything he believed. That's not the point. But the point is to be fair. He desired to find the oldest manuscripts possible. And that is a good line of reasoning. Why? Because the older the manuscript, the less number of copies between the original and it, therefore the less likelihood for mistakes. Because again, every single manuscript has a variant from another in some way, shape, or form. And again, he doesn't mention that, which probably means he hasn't read all these manuscripts, whether in the Byzantine or not. Especially if you go to the Book of Revelation in the Byzantine text, it's kind of wild. You really need the Western text and the Alexandrian text uh, to help you there. Either way, so if you read about how we found Codex Sinaiticus, you'll actually be quite amazed. Number one, it wasn't found in a trash can. I don't think he said that, but many King James onlyists believe that it was found in a trash can. No, a monk had it in his closet wrapped in red cloth, and they don't do that with garbage. Where that came from was where he found a monk on his first visit burning scraps of manuscripts that they didn't need anymore, and they happened to be from the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And he kind of got wild and said, "Stop burning this, you got any more of this stuff?" But anyways, it took two more visits to this place for him to see Codex Sinaiticus. Anyway, there's actually an interesting story of how it ended up in London, but the Russian Tsar kind of ripped it off from the monks. Anyway, the other thing is he says, well, it wasn't in Koine Greek. Well, you've not shown us what Koine Greek is, and I've already talked about what Koine Greek was, and you can go online right now and see a digitized, you see Codex Sinaiticus digitized completely, and you can literally read it online on your computer, and you will find that yes, that was Koine Greek. I mean, it was 300 years removed from the first century, but that was the Greek that they spoke. So, I mean, you haven't proven what Koine Greek is or isn't. And they're back translating this, that, and the other, which is interesting. He mentions back translating because in order to produce the first edition of this, Desiderius Erasmus, who was a Roman Catholic priest, by the way, he back translated from the Latin Vulgate in a couple places, most notably in Revelation 22. The last 6 verses come directly from the Latin Vulgate, which is why you read about the Book of Life instead of the tree of life. All of the other translations, except for King James or New King James and whatnot, read book of life. Their name shall be taken from the book of life instead of the tree of life. Or I'm sorry, they'll be anyway. Either way, every single manuscript of Revelation, Byzantine, Alexandrian, Western, whatever, reads tree of life. But Erasmus messed up because he was rushed, and somehow that ended up all the way through to the King James version. And so I don't know what else to say about that.
Picture
So
this stream flowing out right here, a river coming out. This is your 5,000 manuscripts from which the King James Bible comes. Now, those 5,000 manuscripts date from about the 12th century back into the 7th century, then little pieces in the 4th century, one piece of Matthew dated in the middle of the 1st century before most people thought it was even written. And so there's all these single verses, chapters, a letter from someone in the 3rd century writing to another Christian, a song sung, a portion of scripture here. So you take all these little pieces of manuscripts, some whole books, and when you get on down to 700 AD, major portions, major Bibles, many different translations in different language, Gothic, Coptic, Arabic, the Danish, especially and the English language, the ancient Gothic language, and others like that, come on down. And so the King James Bible in 1611 is based on all of these manuscripts, the traditional text that came down to us from the beginning. Okay, what Tischendorf came up with and Westcott and Hort advocated was older. It dated all the way back to, say, right here. But it's a different stream. It's a stream that comes off and flows separate from all the other Bibles. And it's a narrow stream that comes down to us today. In other words, the river forked. The river forked and say 3rd, 300s, 400, somewhere along there. It forked. Now, what happened was, at that fork, is someone erected, and I'll ask you, which stream would you rather drink out of? Would you rather drink out of this one that had flowed that far, or go back and drink out of the one closer to the source? You'd say, I'd rather drink out of the one closer to the source. And that's what people say. And I can understand that completely. If the stream you're drinking out of flows without interruption. But let's suppose that the stream forked. There was a fork in the road. And somebody erected an outhouse. Right over this stream here. So this stream gets polluted, while this stream runs pure. Now, do you want to drink out of the older one with the outhouse on it, or a younger one? Quite obvious. Just because a manuscript is older, you see, that old manuscript, the Sinaiticus and a Vaticanus text, was rejected by the church as corrupt. That's the reason it was still intact in a monastery. No one wanted to read it. It was impure. It was marred. It had all kinds of mistakes in it. Different copyists had tried to correct it and had all kinds of errors. And that's the stream right now. that all your modern Bibles are coming from. All of them are being produced from a line that was corrupted years and years ago, and it represents less than 1% of the manuscripts that are available in the portion of Scripture. Now, to add to that, we have copies of the Bible in Latin that date back to the early 2nd century, maybe the 1st century, Latin version. And not whole copies, but we have little portions of it, and we have the descent of it in copies that were made. We have Gothic way back in the 7th century, the Gothic language. We have the Germanic. We have back Syriac, Coptic, that's Egyptian languages. Many of the ancient languages. And then we have, dating back before 1000 AD, Danish, German, many of the European languages, many copies made. So what happens is when we take all of the ancient copies of the European languages, as well as the ancient Greek, the ancient Latin, the Arabic, the Syrian language, all those that surrounded Israel, when you take all those copies, they have the same readings in another language as the 1611 King James Bible. This line is called the Textus Receptus.
Okay, I don't want to be crude or harsh, but that was chock full of error, and here's why. So, just to give you an idea, I think the oldest manuscript of that this was that Erasmus, Estienne, and Beza had available was probably from the 10th to the 12th century. Actually, Codex Bezae-Cantabrigiensis, I think, may have been used, but that is a very odd manuscript. I go further into that. That is an early one, but the most of what they had available was 10th to 12th century, or 13th century even, before the age of the printing press, that when it was invented in the 1450 or so. Anyway, the biggest issue with this, of course, he's really good with painting, but he asserts that the line of manuscripts that are ancient, and I mean ancient, I'm talking, we're talking early 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, among many others, of the uncials and whatnot. The assertion is that they were corrupted. Now, he doesn't give any proof that they were corrupted. Maybe he will in the coming videos that he's putting out, but he's asserting that they were corrupted. Now, one, you got to prove that. How were they corrupted? How do you know they were corrupted? Why were they corrupted? But he actually ends up mentioning all of these other translational Bibles. The Syriac, for example. So you have the Peshitta, which is a dialect. It's a dialect of Aramaic, or at least it's an heir of 1st century Aramaic. It's not exactly the same, but you have the Peshitta, which is a collation of of an Aramaic dialect, and it does not always agree with the King James in many of those areas of variation. 1 John 5:7 is not there. I do believe in John 1:18 it uses the term God of Jesus as opposed to only begotten Son, among various others. And another thing too is he would also say that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus were rejected by the church. Well, here's the problem. Erasmus, Estienne, and Beza, and many of the reformers and other scholars throughout the time, you've got George Whitefield and John Wesley, you have D.L. Moody, Charles Spurgeon, John Owen, many of those individuals, they had no clue about Alexandrian text type, Byzantine text type, Western text, Proto-Caesarean. They didn't have any clue about that kind of. They didn't distinguish that. What you had was the Bible. And the problem in the West, in Europe, is when the Roman Catholic Church really sought to grab hold upon the nations of Europe. They banned the Bible from being translated out of Latin. Because if you did that, Martin Luther risked his neck. He could have been turned into a flaming martyr. Uh, but God was obviously in that and protected him, and but many others died because they tried to get the Bible into other languages. The first English translation was the Wycliffe Bible, done in the 1300s. And of course, Wycliffe, after he died, was condemned as a heretic and whatnot. And there were people who suffered for trying to preserve his work, which his was a translation of the Latin Vulgate. Now, one other thing to make sure we put out here, the manuscripts that we have are not whole Bibles. It's not only until centuries later that time later that you start getting collections of, say, Paul's letters or Peter's letters or the Gospels. I think Codex Bezae Canterburyensis is actually of the Gospels. I think that's all it has. Is it the Gospels and Acts? But either or, it's only in this oncoming centuries that you begin to get those collations and collections as the letters circulated to the churches, and then they were copied onward. But anyway, they weren't rejected by the church. As a matter of fact, the reason, and surely he would know this. This is not secret knowledge. This is common knowledge. The Alexandrian text type that was supposedly rejected, why is it that those manuscripts died out? As a matter of fact, the Alexandrian manuscripts for the first millennia were the majority. But why did they die out? Well, maybe because in 632, Islam began to spread. And if you haven't noticed, the spread of Islam is not good for the production of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. All of the churches and Christians were wiped out, essentially, in all the Middle East, North Africa, and even up into Spain and Portugal for a short time, until 732. So the only surviving manuscripts were ones that were very well isolated, namely, let's say, in a monastery at Mount Sinai, or what some believe to be Mount Sinai. Why did that one survive? Well, probably because they were so isolated. And it is Codex Sinaiticus is actually, many scholars have called it a highly corrected text. And what that means is there are thousands of marginal notes, whether they mark out a word and put something over it or whatever, but it was in use for 1,500 years. This was an actively used Bible. This isn't something that, this is an argument that's popular, but it really doesn't hold water, where they say, well, it wasn't used, so therefore it survived. Well, no, the reason it survived was because it was in a very dry area. That's why it survived. Most of the manuscripts that are ancient come from North Africa and the Middle East. Why? Because it's a very dry, arid climate that allows for the preservation of something as fragile as papyri, or let's say something a little stronger such as vellum. A humid temperate climate such as in Greece and Italy and most of Europe, that really doesn't help preserve paper or vellum very well. But anyway, again, much of these statements are just asserted and they're not backed. And you can do all the little the cool artwork and all that to make your illustrations, but if you don't have any substance to back it up, a Christian who takes this information and goes to universities, because here's the thing, it's not just atheistic scholars or Muslim scholars or whoever that are preaching, that are attacking the faith. It's oftentimes many people who are somewhat intelligent, but they just have no idea what they're talking about. Joe Rogan, who has a massive following, is spewing this stuff out. College students are spewing this stuff out, and we're taking our children, giving them this information in this way, not preparing them for what they're about to meet. And they're going to get destroyed. And unfortunately, it's rightfully so, because what they're saying is not true. And so we need to correct that as best we can. And so let's go ahead and continue.
It doesn't exist just in Greek, it exists in multiple languages. Whereas this corrupted text stands alone with supposedly about 25 witnesses, 2 Bibles, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and some little pieces, none of them agreeing with each other, where these all agree. None of them agreeing with each other. The only thing they're similar in this corrupted line of manuscripts is that they all disagree with each other, and they all disagree with this text here. In other words, these were the corrupted Bibles someone produced, and they were rejected by the church. But modern German scholarship picked up the idea of disposing of the Bible by means of creating doubt about its authenticity. Now that's the biggest hoax ever perpetrated upon the church. Now, hand me those 2 books right there. This is well documented. This book, Which Version is the Bible, by Floyd Nolan Jones, goes into great detail. We secured the right to publish this book. I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to help you. But we make that book available at below its original cost, well below. And then here's one, In Awe of Thy Word, by Gail Riplinger. I was reading some of it just this morning. It's well over 1,100 pages. And this is a fascinating book written by a scholar. And I want to show you one thing in it. She purchased, or rather somebody gave her a copy of I think it was 15 different languages, a Bible with 15 different languages. And she owns that. It was written before the King James Bible in 1599. It has the Bible in English in it, but it all has Syriac, Greek, Latin, German, Bohemic, Italic, Gaelic, Anglican, Danish, Polish, and others. In other words, before the King James Bible was produced, what they don't tell you is the Bible was available in multiple languages, reading just like this throughout Europe. And the English King James Bible, there were 5 printed versions, 4 printed versions, 5th the King James, before the King James was translated. And there are English copies of the Bible dating back into the 10th and 11th centuries. One king had the entire book of Revelation written on his ceiling. And so handwritten copies date way back and trace back to the Gothic language, from which the English is derived in part. And you can read the Gothic. In fact, the writer of this book, Gail Riplinger, In Awe of That Word, learned the Gothic language so she could collate and examine the ancient Bible text. Very smart lady. And so she shows you in there how the English is traced back through Gothic and Celtic and all the way back into the Britain, back into as early as the 1st century. And ancient scholars say that Joseph of Arimathea and 11 others, 12 of them, in the 1st century went to the British Isles, which wasn't called Britain at the time, and took the gospel and the Bible and translated it. And so when we say we believe the 1611 King James Bible, we're not ignorant of what we're saying. Now, I've oversimplified this. I've made this very simple. If you want to read a 1,200-page book about it, it's available. If you want to read a 300-page, it's available. And there are other books on the subject. But don't go around smugly thinking that you know something simply because you've heard some preacher that you respect say that the oldest and best manuscripts. Now, next time, this is part 1. In part 2, I'm going to show you what a fraud this ancient manuscript that came from the outhouse actually is. All right, that's just a little bit. Study, make yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed. I'm going to go back to painting, okay?
Okay, so this is the end of his first video, and I'll get to work on the second one and reviewing it as well, because he mentioned there that he oversimplified things. And yes, that's actually the problem. This is not a topic that you can just spend an hour listening to somebody, regardless of their opinion either way, and come out with a good, solid, firm point of view. Like, it's not possible. And he mentions Gail Ripplinger. Okay, here's the deal with Gail Ripplinger. If you read any of her work, New Age Bible versions, I think, was one of the first major ones. You go back and you look at how she's interacted with people, especially with, let's say, Dr. James White, back on their radio exchange, and among various other things. All right, you take her actual quotation, like when she references a work or a book or something, you take the actual references and you look those references up, which with the advent of technology is more widely available. Back when she wrote New Age Bible versions, for example, a lot of that stuff wasn't available to just the average person. I mean, you either had to have a good library, or like stocked library in your home or in your office, or you had to find a library that could get their hands on some of the stuff, such as Westcott's and Hort's sons doing their biographies. She completely takes the quotations and turns them on their head to make her point. And that's not how that works. You can't, and I want you to think of it this way. If somebody 200 years from now was to quote you, or let's just say 100 years from now was to quote you, you would want them to be fair. You would want them to quote you in your context and make your application and deal with your application, whether they agree with it or not. And so you bring up Gail Ripplinger's work and you actually look at the references, you will find that she has more errors in her works. And this is just being a student, being a good student and being diligent. And in your study, you actually put forth the effort to look through these things and test them. You'll find that she just completely distorts what people say, and you cannot take her words at face value. And I haven't read In All of Thy Word yet, but you can look through works on both sides of this equation, from Which Bible to Gail Ripplinger's stuff to D.A. Waite's material. But you could also go to the flip side, from James White's works, the works of Dan Wallace, among others, and you actually give them a fair comparison. James White's The King James Only Controversy is a solid work on this topic, and I would encourage you to take that one and take New Age Bible versions and read them together and look at the arguments in the documentation. Go to the references. This is going to take time, but God has given us so much information and so many resources today. The Christian today, he's given us so much that he's going to hold us responsible. Many of the things that he talked about there, I've already talked over. The majority text, again, there are variants within the majority text that you have to go through. No two Greek manuscripts read exactly alike. I believe Dr. Dan Wallace has, I believe he's studied it out, and he's done all the work with counting up a lot of this stuff. He's the director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and they have a lot of manuscripts that are actually digitized. That's actually what their ministry is doing, is they're going around the world digitizing these manuscripts, so you can go online and read them or reference them. And so he mentions there are at least 6 to 10 variations for the closest two manuscripts we have. And again, a lot of that, I mean, you don't even know where to start, because it's just such an oversimplification of so many things that it leads to error. And again, I've mentioned a lot of these versions Uh, Anything that came from the TR uh, printed text from the Reformation era, they're going to be fairly the same. But did you know that the German Luther Bible and William Tyndale's and even the King James and the Geneva Bible, all of those which have variants within them, they don't always agree. Some of them take Robert Estienne's variants. Some take Erasmus's variants. As a matter of fact, the German Luther Bible doesn't even have 1 John 5:7 in it, I don't believe, because 1 John 5:7 was not a part of the TR until Erasmus's third edition, which is an interesting story behind that, because there are maybe 6 total manuscripts that contain it, and Erasmus believed that he was deceived on, basically somebody wrote up some manuscript to refute Erasmus, because he said, if you can find a manuscript that has it, I'll put it in. And Codex Montfortianus is believed to be that one, and it looks like it was made to order, if you will. but anyway, those are issues that we can get into later. But here's the thing: don't just take the 1 hour that you get from somebody, or 30 minutes of this and whatnot. I mean, this is a topic that takes a lot of study and a lot of prayer and seeking and diligence. This is number one. I'll get to number two as quickly as I can as time allows. I'm actually staying out overnight for my employer. So I might have some time this week, once I'm off duty, at least, to get to the next one. But anyways, hit like and subscribe and comment with any questions that you got. I'm open to them. I'm open to discussion. Scholarly discussion and debate is worthwhile, but throwing names and accusations and this, that, and the other about impugning character. I mean, we're all brothers and sisters in faith. This is not the foundation of our fellowship. The foundation of our fellowship is Jesus Christ, is the Son of God, God the Son, who is the propitiation for our sins, and not only for ours, but also for that of the whole world, in whom we have redemption and reconciliation by faith, by grace through faith, so on and so forth. That is the basis of our fellowship and us being brothers and sisters in Christ. And so God bless, and see you next time.